Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining Mark and Brian on the radio.
I didn't even think about that before. Mark and Brian.
Yeah.
That's a blast in the past. I'm an old LA guy. Are they still doing it?
I honestly don't know. Does terrestrial radio still exist? I'm kidding.
Well, I just arranged for a review of a Magnum Dynalab tuner, so I think it might be. We'll see.
Well, you have reached the Occasional Podcast, Season 7, Episode 8. And as we already said, Mark Phillips and Brian Hunter from Part-Time Audiophile Network and the Occasional Podcast Wondery, that is, here to join you for a very special episode. Is Class D coming into its own? And I know that Mark has a lot to kind of add to the subject because he is hot in the thick of it. So I did want to kind of immediately kick it off in the intro to Mark. But we will get to the meat and potatoes of the whole thing with one of our good friends, Jonathan Derda of Mofi Electronics. He has a really deep dive and has been doing a lot into the technical more thing. He explains it. He kind of lays out the framework for the whole idea of what is going on with Class D. But to kind of give you like a right here and now glimpse at what's going on with Class D, Mark, what's hot on your plate as of late in terms of Class D?
What we've discovered at Part-Time Audiophile over the last year or two is we've been reviewing some Class D amplifiers and saying, is this really Class D? Because this sounds really good. This isn't what I used to listen to. And I think we all used to turn up our nose a little bit at Class D. My initial exposure to it was through active or powered speakers that use Class D modules in them.
Right.
And I always felt like I sensed a dryness to Class D sound. I mean, it was okay, passable, but it was never going to pass for what I would consider high-end audio sound. Until recently, over the last year, I've reviewed 2 or 3 Class D amplifiers. We've had a couple more, including Tidal Audio's Intra, which is a very new version of Class D. We're getting to the point in the magazine where we cannot foster a anti-Class D bias because, quite simply, it sounded really good to our ears.
That's kind of the crutch of what's like happening now. We're seeing progression in the arena of Class D. And a lot of that, I feel like, as John will discuss, is based around the idea of utilizing new materials, including gallium nitride, or GaN, as the short is. So that, like I said, we'll get into more of the tech about that particular thing. That's kind of I would say, not a whole lot happens in the tech arena of audio and R&D, but that one is like sprinkling the gallium nitride on amplifier design, and it's like kind of spicing up the recipe. So without further ado, Jonathan Derda from Mofi Electronics helping us explore, is Class D coming into its own? Today's episode is brought to you by Musical Surroundings. For over 30 years, Musical Surroundings has distributed high-performance analog playback equipment to vinyl enthusiasts and music lovers throughout the United States. Based in Oakland, California, Musical Surroundings represents world-class brands like Clear Audio, Hanna, DS Audio, and their own line of Musical Surroundings phono preamplifiers. To learn more about the exceptional turntables, cartridges, and analog accessories they offer, visit musicalsurroundings.com. That's musicalsurroundings.com. Today's episode is brought to you by WellPleasedAV. Importer Mark Sosa has hand-selected a remarkable collection of high-performance brands like Inuos, QLN, Marison, Qualiton, Gigawatt, and more. Each of these specialist manufacturers are driven by engineering products that communicate the lifeblood of music. Check out everything WellPleasedAV has to offer by visiting www.wellpleasedav.com. That's www.wellpleasedav.com. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Very special guest today to help us explain, explore, and just really kind of think about, is Class D amplification coming into its own. Class D has been around for a while. It's no secret that a lot of audiophiles don't consider it the best topology, the best type of way to get amplification. So we have John Derda here from Mofi Electronics. Mofi also makes records, but he specializes in distribution of products. He can talk a little bit more about what he does now in his story, but they have a series of electronics that are coming out. I have heard their turntable, and it's awesome. They have a preamp, and they have a wide range of kind of really nice audiophile-focused products. But he also distributes other products from other parts of the world. And so he has a vast experience that we're going to kind of walk through. John, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to get into this one because I feel like Class D, it's such an interesting kind of talking point and controversial subject at times, but it really shouldn't be. So I'm really excited to unfold this guy. Why does Class D exist?
Well, you have a lot of different classes of amplifiers, and I think there's been some clarity about Class D not necessarily meaning digital, so we can just get that kind of preconceived notion out of the way up front. But you already have multiple classes of amplifiers. You have Class A, Class AB. There's also Class G and H, which are less typically used, but some brands like Cambridge, I think, uses, or Arcam uses Class G. Class H you'll find in a lot of Bluetooth speakers and other products. We used Class H on the Peachtree Audio Deep Blue back when I was with that company. So there's multiple classes of amplifiers. And the gold standard, speaking as an audiophile, hi-fi enthusiast, is Class A. Taking all the other variables out of the equation, people voice products differently. Power supplies make a big difference. Right. Output devices make a big difference. So we're just speaking in general terms. Class A is really the bar for sound quality, but it has its drawbacks as well. It's a power hog. It's on all the time, and you're only going to achieve probably 40% efficiency. So that means if you're going to just, let's say 50% to keep the math simple. If you want to generate 100 watts of power with the Class A amp, you are also going to generate 100 watts or more of heat as well. And so these things are hot. They're very hot, and that means you need to have big chassis. If you're going to have higher power, you need to have big heat sinks, and heat sinks are often one of the most expensive components when you're building an amplifier. But it sounds great. It sounds great. So if you don't care about heat, size, energy efficiency, and you can get enough power from a Class A amp, and you have great speakers, that is the bar. That's the high bar, the high water mark for sound quality. More typically, though, you're going to find Class AB. That's probably what 90% of the listeners at home have in their amplifiers, whether that's a home theater receiver or a dedicated 2-channel amp or an integrated amplifier. Class AB was an attempt to get close to Class A sound with a little greater efficiency. Not quite as sweet or pure sounding as like a 300B Class A single-ended triode design, but a bit more power, reduced size, higher energy efficiency. Now you have Class D, and that really started off in car audio systems where size and heat were big limitations. And so those amplifiers were originally designed to drive subwoofers primarily in terms of their audio application. So they could be noisy at higher frequencies, those early generation amps, but they were super powerful. They had great punch in the bass. And then about 20 years ago, Class D started being used in home audio. And I think what most people are going to be familiar with was Bang & Olufsen's attempt at it, which was ICE power.
You did mention Class B. Is there a reason why Class B by itself isn't used as much? Like, because we have Class A, Class AB, but no one ever just has a straight Class B. Why is that, do you think?
In simple terms, it doesn't sound good. So it's Class B doesn't really sound good for audio on its own.
Well, and that's really the main reason why any other topology doesn't come into play very often, right? Because A sounds, to a lot of people, I'm not going to say this definitively, but to most people, A sounds pretty good, and then we don't use the rest because they don't sound as good. So that is like, that makes complete sense why it's not as popular. And also, when it comes to Class D, the benefits start to outweigh the sacrifices, right? Because of the size. Right, everything so much about technology in general, and everything we do is about getting it smaller and smaller and smaller, just like microchips, right? We want it to fit into a smaller space and use a lot less electricity.
And Class D, that outweighs, right, the sonic sacrifices, so to speak, or it did. So that's why we're trying to kind of explore, why is it coming? Are we getting there? What's going on? So, yeah, please, now tell me a little bit more about your personal experience as you move into Class D. What is your experience with it in terms of like how it sounds, the products you've worked with that used it, maybe how it compares to AB and so forth?
My first personal experience was with, I think Rotel had an amplifier about 20 years ago. I was working at a retailer in Colorado called Listen Up at the time, and they had Bowers & Wilkins and Musical Fidelity and Sonus Faber, all these great brands. And we got this Rotel Class D amp, and it was super small compared to a traditional amplifier, extremely powerful, and relatively affordable for the amount of power it was offering. And it had a unique sonic character. And once you started learning more about Class D, the strengths and weaknesses 20 years ago, you came to realize, okay, this isn't for everybody. At the time, you know, if we did a A/B shootout in the showroom with the Musical Fidelity versus the Rotel, the Musical Fidelity, and again, guys, this is 20 years ago. I'm not applying it to the brands today. The Musical Fidelity smoked it. I mean, it wasn't even close. So I think a lot of people had that same experience with the earlier Class D home audio amps and just said, okay, Class D sucks. You know, the benefits don't outweigh the drawbacks, like energy efficiency. Okay, yeah, that's getting more on people's radar at this point for you know, good reason. At the end of the day, we're buying sound quality and we're buying this kind of musical emotional experience, which Class D at that point couldn't really deliver. Now, you fast forward to, in my career, 5-10 years later, I was working with David Solomon and the guys at Peachtree Audio. And when Peachtree launched their first two products, they were all Class AB designs. But at a certain point in the cycle, we said, you know what, we need more power. And for anybody that's seen a Peachtree amp, it's like 3/4 or half the size of a traditional component. So trying to use Class B in a small box like that, I don't want to say it was a lifestyle component, but it definitely had some of that kind of lifestyle conscious, you know, aesthetic and size to it. We could not put a bigger Class AB amp in it. I think our biggest Class AB amp was like 60 watts per channel, and we had guys trying to drive big, you know, B&W speakers with this that had really low impedance loads that needed power, and our old amps couldn't do that. And so we started to explore Class D. We used ICE power modules from Bang & Olufsen, but we also, like many others in the business who started using Class D, tried to add our own kind of secret ingredients, not so secret really, but our own, you know, thumbprint on the sound by including things like a tube buffer to kind of warm things up, you know, discrete circuitry on the input buffer, working hard on the power supply, which makes a huge difference to the sound. And so I thought we struck a nice balance, sometimes more successfully than other times, in terms of getting as close to Class AB by using Class D, but getting the power and drive that our customers were asking for. But there were still some drawbacks, quite frankly. I mean, it wasn't as fleshed out of a mid-range. The bass was great. The high end, you know, was kind of limited, a little thin sounding at times, depending on what speakers you were using. But hey, this is a hobby of compromise. You know, you're trying to balance things out with the components and cables. So Class D became very popular, and you know, thousands and thousands of people use it. But it still didn't get to the Class A level of purity and kind of sonic richness.
I in your general just kind of experience, is it one of those, if you come out with a product that's like a Class D and it's on the, I was going to ask, you know, if it's on the label, but come to think of it, I feel like almost always, that's not true. Sometimes, almost always, if it is Class D, it's almost like hidden. It's like this dirty little secret. Now, the people who do come out and say, hey, look at you can see the size is smaller. It's so obvious a lot of times. If you got a smaller one and it has a lot of watts, it's not a secret, right? But when it does come out, it's generally that they are using ICE modules that you referred to earlier, and they're like, listen, we're trying to use the best kind of available audiophile tech. And then there's been a few companies that have tried to really like push the envelope forward. And one of those buzzwords that I keep hearing but isn't really hitting the mainstream is gallium nitride. Can you just explore a little bit what your knowledge of this? Is it a chemical? Is it a technology? I mean, it sounds just like what I keep hearing, and I think it's funny. It's like I would just imagine a regular amp, and they're just like throwing this chemical on it, and all of a sudden it's faster. Because one of the issues that people have, I use the word faster because one of the things that have been expressed in Class D is that somehow there is a relationship with the deterioration or the not as high output, sonically speaking, of course, of Class D is the fact that the switching isn't fast enough. That the rate at which the switching back and forth is part of the problem that causes a little less pleasure from the listening experience. Can you talk about your take on that? And I'm interested to know what you know about this chemical that everybody keeps talking about.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting, and I just had my first hands-on experience with it not too long ago. You know, some brands like I think it was Technics may have been the first mainstream brand to use GaN or gallium nitride. So gallium nitride is simply a different material used as opposed to the silicon that you'll find in a typical transistor. So all of our transistors use silicon wafers. Obviously, we have Silicon Valley for a reason. I mean, the computer industry is built upon silicon, and so are your typical audio output devices. Back in the 80s, I remember late 80s, early 90s, the term MOSFET was a major selling point, like to the point where companies like Pioneer would put MOSFET in big, bold letters on their products. At that time, MOSFET was replacing BJTs or bipolar output transistors because of what you just said. They were faster, they were quieter, they just sounded better. Nelson Pass might say, well, that's not always true. And of course, there's always exceptions to every rule, but that was the general understanding back then. So a lot of great amplifiers today use MOSFET output devices, and you're right. If you look at Class D, so we've got the energy efficiency, which we didn't really talk about. They're 96% energy efficient as opposed to what we said earlier about Class A being, on a good day, 40, 50%, really 40%, or lower sometimes, energy efficient. So you're getting a lot of power. Class D can be much smaller, so it's more efficient, more watts per inch than any other topology, but it's the bandwidth. And I think we have to look at how we perceive music as to why that switching speed would be a problem. The upper harmonic registers, even things we can't hear, you know, our human hearing is typically limited from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Those things above 20 kilohertz, you can't hear directly, but they affect all of the fundamental frequencies below it. With a Class D amp, because it's called a switching amp, the byproduct of that switching action is generating noise at high frequencies. So you have to create an output filter to filter away all of that noise. Well, there's no free lunch. Anytime you filter something, right, even if it's in this high register, it affects the things below it. And I think that's one reason why you get this sense of thinness in the mid-range or in the top end with a lot of Class D designs, or you have in the past. Gallium nitride has a much shorter, what we call dead band or dead time, which basically, it's a terrible term to explain, but if you look at an output device trying to reproduce a square wave on an oscilloscope, so, you know, it's a flat line, straight up, 90-degree angle, flat line, 90-degree angle, straight down. You know, that's a square wave. And if you could reproduce a square wave very cleanly and accurately, you typically are going to have a high-performance neutral amplifier. With a MOSFET output device, it's like me getting out of bed this morning. It kind of starts up very slowly, so it's not a straight, vertical line. It's at an angle. Then you have your cup of coffee, and you might get a little jittery, so that's at the top flat line. And so you kind of overshoot the rise, and you have these kind of squiggles in the top line. Then you level off nice and clean, and then you slope back down. So it's not exactly a square wave when you look at it on an oscilloscope. Mm-hmm. And that rise time, instead of going straight up, is the dead band. So it's kind of like, think of it as your response time or torque in a car. You know, one thing that people love about electric cars like your Tesla, not your Tesla, I don't know what you drive as an electric car, but it has that instant acceleration, right, as opposed to a gasoline engine. That's what GaN really does. GaN is instant acceleration straight up with a clean top of the square wave and then back down again. What does that mean? That means we can operate at much faster switching speeds we can push the noise at an even higher frequency. So we can allow for much more of that upper harmonic information to be maintained in the output of the amplifier. And what you end up with is something that is not only faster sonically in terms of response time, but you have a much richer, more neutral, much closer to that Class A ideal sound quality.
Okay. So what is your experience with this in reality now? Because you have some stuff that you have worked with in the past, and now you have some new stuff that's coming to market just now. I'd love for you to kind of talk about your personal experience and what your thoughts and feelings are on the evolution of this sound and where we are, where we went, and where we're going.
Yeah, so GAN is a real technology. I think as an industry, we've done a really good job of taking Class D and making pretty respectable sound out of it. I mean, and some better than others. Like we talked about earlier with the input buffer changes, tubes, power supplies, things like that. We can get really nice sound that way. But GAN, GAN is a big technology. This isn't limited to hi-fi. Some cell phone chargers even advertise they have GAN transistors because it's a more efficient, more powerful charger in a smaller package.
Interesting.
5G cell phone towers are using GAN transistors as well for those same reasons. So this is something you're going to see wide adoption of, which will also hopefully drive the price down. Right now, you've seen my old colleagues at Peachtree are one of the early ones to use GAN. Technics, as I said, they're using GAN. And my personal experience now is with a company out of South Korea, out of Seoul, called Hi-Fi Rose. So Hi-Fi Rose, if anybody's seen it, has been reviewed a lot lately for their high-end streamer/network, DAC players like the RS-150B and the RS-250. Beautiful touchscreen display devices. These guys are really on kind of the cutting edge of technology. And they decided to build an analog integrated amplifier. And they wanted it to be powerful and quiet, and their engineers chose to use GAN transistors. And so about 5 days here before the show, I finally had a GAN amplifier in my house. Now, I think I've said this to you before on a podcast we've done. If I'm on a desert island, I'm taking my turntable and I'm taking my 300B tube amp, right, in a pair of LS35As. Like, that's my sound. There's a mid-range purity to that kind of equipment that most solid-state doesn't get. I've had some other great solid-state amps in my house, both Class A and Class AB, that I really love. So using those as a benchmark and having this GAN amp show up was really surprising. It had all the things I expected it to have. It sounded powerful, and I don't mean just that it could play loud. It sounded effortless, like it was barely working, even driving high volumes. It had great bass. In fact, it had better bass than almost any other solid-state amp I have. But what shocked me was how smooth and natural the top end was while not being rolled off. And that was the sacrifice before, when you would tweak these Class D amps with other ways to kind of flavor the sound. Is the trick was to typically roll off the high end so it didn't sound thin, but you lose all this sense of air and spaciousness when you do that. That wasn't the case with this amplifier. Now, I don't want to be self-promotional, just talking about Hi-Fi Rose, but it really got me excited about the potential of GAN. And just based on my last 5 days and now 3 days here at Expono with it, my gut feeling is this is going to be the path forward for so many companies to offer more powerful amplifiers at, closer, let's say 95% of the way there to that pure Class A sound, but with a lot more power at a much lower cost. So I'm very excited about where GAN can take us in the future.
When I think about audio and the technologies that we choose to embrace, so much of it is very legacy. This tech has been around a long time, and it's been beautiful to see the resurgence of the turntable and like tactile, real life tech. But when it comes to amplification, I feel like it's a piece in the chain that could use a reduction in size. These Class A amps are so big and so hot. That technology to me seems just a tick outdated. And even though it sounds the best, we really need to move forward. And in the science of cell phones and the science of all the amplifiers, and you said, most people listen to Class D. There's probably thousands of them. I was thinking to myself, for all the cell phones out there and all the headphone amplifiers and all this, there's so many people listening to so many amplifiers constantly all the time, right? We listen to more artificial sound now than we probably do real sound for the most part, right? That this is the area for improvement of all the areas. Speaker tech, it's got different materials that are fun and this thing, but the amplifier is the piece of the chain, I think, that might most likely see the most change in the next 20, 30, 40 years because it's going to get the most use, right? It's the size matters to the implementation and because of mobility and such. So this is very exciting. I think, if they can get this going, especially on the transistor arena, companies are going to be willing to invest in this and make it better. And if we can just kind of get those efficiencies going, I foresee actually more of like a power play, right? So the less power, everybody's only so about sound quality. I'll be honest with you. In my previous job, I had a presentation done by XM Radio way back in the day when it sounded like complete garbage. And it was like the lowest bandwidth possible because they're trying to cram all these channels through a whatever size stream. And the guy presented, and I raised my hand, and I said, what about the sound quality? The sound quality is not so good. And he just simply said, we've polled all of the listeners in the general population, and they don't care about sound quality. So he was saying flat out, most people don't care about sound quality. The point I'm trying to make is that maybe marketers won't invest the R&D to push the technology forward unless there's a real, reasonable, actionable thing. And I think power is always a concern with batteries and portability. So this is where we have a chance to have the mainstream help fund some of the technology that'll make everything better,
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, I want people to know that just because something will advertise that it has GaN doesn't guarantee that it's going to sound great, right? You can have great ingredients, but if you don't know how to use them, you're going to end up with a bad meal. That's kind of the same thing with audio. And once GaN becomes well known, you can certainly count on people using it as a selling tool. But as always, you got to judge products with your ears more than what the spec sheet tells you. You've absolutely hit a critical point that our industry is slow to adopt technology. A lot of engineers are entrenched in a certain way of thinking, or they have a comfort zone, and they haven't been motivated because there hasn't really been the customer demand to change. But this new generation of buyers is kind of forcing that change, whether they're worried about climate or just, hey, I have kids at home. I get nervous when I have my big tube amps on and they're trying to run around the living room.
Right.
Like, not only could they break the amplifier if they tripped or kicked a ball into it, but those things are freaking hot, right? So I don't want anyone getting hurt from that, but it sounds great and I keep it up out of the way. But Class D takes away any of those concerns. There's also a trend in our industry of loudspeakers being more and more difficult to drive because there are these high-power amplifiers that can drive low-impedance loads, so speaker designers don't really care about having a higher efficiency. Obviously, there's exceptions to that, but for the most part, the big names in loudspeakers aren't highly efficient, and they have these really low-impedance loads. So we need more powerful amps, we need more watts, we need higher current, and we need it in a smaller box. So yeah, the 5G thing, GaN is going to be used in a lot of AI driving systems in cars. So we're going to see it used more and more often, which will drive the price down. And my gut feeling, again, is in not 40 years, 5 years, maybe 10, because we are slow to adopt things, a large part of the market will be using this technology.
Wow, I love that. I love it when you draw a line in the sand, especially when it's at the 5-year mark, because I'm like, hey, I might live to see that. Maybe we might make it. I want to see some change. Is there any kind of revolution in your mind in the audio industry that would be as big as this one? Is there any other change that you see that's been revolutionary in terms of redefining a category of product?
Well, the most obvious one that comes to mind is the widespread adoption of streaming in high-end audio. I mean, again, we don't operate in the mainstream. We're two-channel audio manufacturers and distributors, so we're a niche category. We're not selling AirPods or anything like that. But streaming has finally become the way to listen to music in your system. That's why Hi-Fi Rose has been so successful for us. Other than that, there is, I think we're on the precipice of seeing more adoption of integrated, self-powered, active speakers with network technology built in. I think that's trending up as well, but we're still at the early days of that being accepted in the mind of audiophiles as a good alternative to a multi-component system. So there is change happening for sure. It's an exciting time to be in hi-fi.
Yeah, I think that we actually kind of, in my mind, we won a small battle when Apple finally adapted lossless streaming for free. I mean, not for free, but for no additional cost, right? They just added it one day to their, what was like limited at 320K bit rate, right? All of a sudden, we just have lossless on the same platform, ubiquitous on all your units. Now, everybody who doesn't love Apple, that's fine, but we were struggling with two service providers that did high-res audio streaming for years and years and years. And everybody's like, when's it coming? And when's it coming? And then within 2 to 3, Amazon, all this. And then finally Apple was like the last domino to fall. And now they were like saying, okay, in a way, this is where we are in relationship to my earlier story with XM is we're admitting that people actually like sound quality. And I think part of that problem was that they didn't know. There's an education bump where people know intrinsically they want something that sounds closer to real life, but they're okay with it if it's portable and easy. So if you have it portable, easy, and it sounds more like real life, we're all starting to win, and we're all starting to get closer to the end goal of hi-fi for everyone and, closer connection to the music.
I know we're going to be on Apple Podcasts with this, and I'm a big Apple fan, and we've worked with them at numerous companies I've been associated with. I would just use this opportunity, if anyone at Apple is listening, is make it easier to understand how to use your high res and make it more compatible with a broader range of components and let it out of the sandbox. So streaming products, a lot of them third-party products can't use Apple Music high res. In order to get it into your hi-fi system, you either need to have an iPad with this adapter kit. And I think it's just too complicated to tap into right now. Even their own, I think, basic AirPods can't support it. So I agree. There has been more adoption by the mainstream tech companies due to the increase in bandwidth available. It's kind of easy for them to flip a switch to do that. I don't know what's taken Spotify so long to do it. They're really the last domino that announced.
You were absolutely right. The last domino to fall would be Spotify because the ubiquitous of that is like, man, there's so many users. It was like one of the first big guys to get their foot in the door and really push it open for a lot of mainstream consumers. So there's hope.
Yeah, I guess in summary, Class A, I would say, is still the benchmark in sonic purity, or however you want to phrase it. It can deliver just beautiful sound quality, and it's not going to go away, just like vinyl hasn't gone away.
Right.
That even if GaN gets 99% of the way there, or some other graphene transistor or something else comes along, there's going to be a pretty large audience of people that still want Class A. Class AB likely will be the bigger domino to fall in my mind, just because it's going to start becoming impractical to use these, components, big heat sinks, big linear power supplies, when it's not going to offer a distinct advantage over high-end Class D solutions. Again, there will be exceptions to that. In my personal experience playing this GaN amp from Hi-Fi Rose, it took a $20,000 Class AB amp to be noticeably better. But anything I had in my system, at least below that, there might have been a give and take here or there, but it didn't outperform the GaN Class D. And I think that's a big step in the right direction for Class D. So I think Class AB is going to become less of an option for a lot of companies, for a lot of products, especially multi-channel companies where you have to pack a lot of amplifiers into one box. It just doesn't make any sense to use Class AB now. So it's a bright future for us because now we can have a high efficiency, high power, and still get great sound. And as the prices come down, I think what you touched upon, it's going to impact a much wider audience of music lovers.
John, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Brian.
Today's episode is also brought to you by one of the originals in high-end audio, Purist Audio Designs. Purist Audio Design made the first fluid-shielded audio cable over 35 years ago and still makes them today right here in the US. For over 35 years, Purist Audio has connected you to the music. They passionately make high-end, high-crafted audio cables designed specifically to the needs of your system. They list their specs, such as resistance and shield quality, and you can find them at PURISTAUDIODESING.com. Purist Audio Designed is veteran-owned and available worldwide. Today's episode is also sponsored by SCHIIT Audio. SCHIIT Audio designs and builds audio components in California and Texas. Based in Valencia and Corpus Christi, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit SCHIITdotCOM or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's SCHIIT.com. What else has kind of been on your mind about Class D, Mark?
Everybody seems to be discovering the same things about Class D. And one of the things that he brought up, so the first Class D amplifier, standalone power amplifier that I reviewed was from Jeff Rowland Design Group, and it was the Model 125. It's the little one. You know, people talk to, oh, have you seen that little Rowland amp? And so, 125 watts per channel. It is 8.8 pounds, I think. So I literally could pick it up out of the box with one hand and put it on the rack. And I said, is this Class D? Because it doesn't say anywhere Class D. I looked on the website, and it doesn't say Class D. And that goes back to what Derda said about the dirty little secret, that people, they don't want to come right out and say, look at our new Class D amplifier, because there's still some biases against them. And it's a little bit like when you have to say, yes, it's made in China. It's a problem, even though there's a lot of good stuff coming out of China these days. So when I asked Jeff Rowland about Class D and how he's able to turn it into something that sounds as good as the Model 125 did, he has a really good explanation that it's a module. It's kind of like DAC chips, where people used to really be particular about which chip was being used in their DAC, and they all had their favorites. And I had people saying, well, I hate ESS, but I like this and this and that. And they all have their favorites. But it's kind of the same thing with Class D modules, is that it isn't the module itself, just like it isn't the DAC chip. It's what you do with it and where it is in the design, the circuit design. And so in a lot of cases, what John Derda mentioned too, was that there are some filters going on in buffers in the chain, in the playback chain, that they can really, really kind of tune that sound so that it doesn't sound like the Class D modules of old. Because basically the Class D modules of old were basically just kind of plugged in and left alone. They weren't doing anything to them. They were just kind of accepting what they offered. But nowadays, the real designers who are using Class D are figuring out ways to make them perform and sound more like what we're used to, especially in terms of what a Class A amplifier sounds like and a Class AB amplifier. They're doing these things, and it's fooling me, because when I listened to the Rowland, for the first time, I could not say this is Class D merely by listening to it. Short of just me opening up the unit and looking for the module, I wasn't sure when I first got it. I had to do research, and that tells me something, that this stuff is getting so good that it's no longer, Class D is no longer going to be this controversial subject. It's going to be a tool for us to get to the next phase of amplifier design. So that's what John Derda said, that really, I agreed with, is like, man, we are coming into it. We are finding out how to use it properly. We're getting better out of it, and it's such a great solution. And I'll just go to one more thing, is that I reviewed the AVM Ovation CS 6.3, and it was an all-in-one, a $14,000 all-in-one. So this is an integrated, had a built-in DAC. It had everything, including a built-in CD player. And it was 500 watts per channel, and yet it was very easy to pick up and move around. It was probably only 35, 40 pounds, and I said, 500 watts per channel, what's going on in here? And of course, the little voice in my head immediately said, it's Class D too. And I looked it up, it's Class D. I would own that piece in a heartbeat, because it did everything. It was an all-in-one box, and yet the sound quality was amazing. And a lot of it had to do with how AVM, a German company, is implementing Class D modules. And I think in Europe, they're really, really getting into Class D right now because they're finding out how flexible it is to use. Smaller amplifiers, one-box solutions that sound fantastic. I will never bash Class D again, just based on experiences I've had in last year. I've had nothing but good experiences. It's the future. I totally believe it. That and tubes. Tubes will continue. The story for 2022 will be 300B amplifiers and Class D. You're going to have a choice of one of the two. Nothing else will matter anymore.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and Audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.